Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on containment and crisis from Korea to Vietnam. The core question is this: how much war-making power can a president accumulate before emergency becomes the normal way the country fights? The core competency is to explain how post-war events in nations such as Korea, Vietnam, China, and Cuba influenced American fears of a global communist threat emerging from the Soviet Union.
How much war-making power can a president accumulate before emergency becomes the normal way the country fights? By the late 1940s, the United States had already built alliances, aid programs, intelligence offices, and a global anti-communist vocabulary. What remained unsettled was how far those institutions would allow presidents to go when crisis arrived. Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam answered that question in stages, each one enlarging executive reach, even when Congress or the United Nations still appeared in the formal record. Modern crisis politics rewarded speed. Officials feared that delay would invite defeat, alarm allies, or permit communist gains that could spread through the logic later called domino theory. Speed therefore shifted power toward the White House, military staffs, intelligence briefers, and small advisory circles able to act quickly. Containment in crisis became a constitutional problem as much as a diplomatic one. The issue was no longer whether the republic could fight a declared war. It was whether it could keep democratic oversight intact while relying on emergency language, rapid delegation, and executive discretion to manage confrontation after confrontation. That question sits beneath Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam alike. The first major precedent came in Korea. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel into Soviet and American occupation zones, a temporary arrangement that hardened into rival states by 1948. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north under Kim Il-sung, and the Republic of Korea in the south under Syngman Rhee. Border clashes, ideological hostility, and rival claims to legitimacy made the division unstable. When North Korean forces invaded on June 25, 1950, Truman treated the attack as a test case for the credibility of containment after the fall of China and the adoption of NSC 68. The mechanics of the response are central. Because the Soviet delegate was boycotting the Security Council over the China seat issue, the United Nations passed resolutions calling for assistance to repel the attack. Truman ordered U.S. air and naval action, then ground troops without asking Congress for a formal declaration of war. Early retreat gave way to a defensive line around the Pusan perimeter. General Douglas MacArthur then launched the amphibious landing at Incheon on September 15, 1950. Incheon succeeded because it exploited surprise, tides, naval gunfire, and joint planning. It cut North Korean supply lines and enabled the recapture of Seoul. The war then moved north toward the Yalu River, prompting Chinese intervention in late 1950 and a brutal reversal for UN forces. Korea established the model of limited war. Truman refused MacArthur's pressure for attacks on China and possible use of nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. When MacArthur publicly challenged administration policy, Truman dismissed him in April 1951 to preserve civilian control. The armistice of 1953 restored a divided peninsula rather than outright victory. The crisis showed that the United States would commit major force under a global anti-communist framework, but it also showed that presidents could define the legal form of that force through UN language and appropriations rather than declaration. That precedent shaped later crises. Korea also revealed how quickly emergency arguments could become standing deployments. American troops remained in South Korea after the armistice, and the 38th parallel became a militarized frontier backed by bases, air cover, and alliance commitments. A war launched without declaration produced a permanent security presence in East Asia. That outcome showed later presidents that crisis response could generate long-term strategic positions even when the immediate fighting ended without formal victory. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 placed a new crisis close to U.S. shores. Fidel Castro's government nationalized property, moved toward alliance with the Soviet Union, and survived growing American hostility. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 emerged from CIA planning first approved under Eisenhower and carried forward under John F. Kennedy. Cuban exiles trained in Guatemala and Nicaragua landed at Playa Girón, expecting local uprising and stronger American support than they received. The operation collapsed within days because secrecy failed, air support was limited, and Castro's forces responded quickly, The failure damaged Kennedy's standing and intensified his determination not to appear weak in later confrontations. That pressure shaped the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. U.S. reconnaissance discovered Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. Kennedy rejected immediate invasion and rejected a straight airstrike as the only option. Instead, he announced a naval quarantine, a term chosen because blockade had the legal meaning of war. The ex-com advisory process considered air attacks, invasion, diplomacy, and quarantine, while U.S. strategic forces moved to higher alert. Soviet ships approached the line, some turned back, and negotiations proceeded through public messages and secret channels. The settlement removed Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American public pledge not to invade Cuba and a private agreement to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey later. The crisis demonstrated that Cold War presidents could use carefully calibrated military pressure, emergency secrecy, and semantic precision to manage nuclear danger. It also normalized the idea that a small closed circle could steer the country through possible annihilation. The missile crisis unfolded over days of reconnaissance, public messaging, and back-channel bargaining rather than one single decision. U-2 photographs taken on October 14th were reviewed before Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22nd. During the following week, ExComm weighed the legal status of blockade, the likelihood of Soviet retaliation in Berlin, and the danger that airstrikes might miss operational launchers. The administration also managed Allied communication and domestic preparation while military commanders pushed for stronger options. Crisis management and nuclear politics therefore required information control, timing, and the ability to keep several channels moving at once. Vietnam widened crisis management into prolonged war. After the 1954 Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, successive administrations supported South Vietnam with money, advisors, and intelligence. Ngo Dinh Diem's government depended on American aid while confronting insurgency, factionalism, and unpopular policies such as the Strategic Hamlet Program. Kennedy expanded the advisory mission to more than 16,000 personnel before his death in 1963. Lyndon Johnson inherited a deteriorating situation and feared that withdrawal would damage U.S. credibility in Asia and weaken his domestic position against Republican critics. The Gulf of Tonkin incidents of August 1964 supplied the trigger for formal congressional delegation. Reports surrounding the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy in the Gulf produced a White House request for authority. Congress responded with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the president to take all necessary measures to repel attacks and prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. Johnson then escalated in stages. Operation Rolling Thunder began in 1965 as a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Ground troop levels rose sharply, reaching more than 180,000 by the end of 1965 and more than 500,000 by 1968. General William Westmoreland pursued attrition through search and destroy operations, while Washington measured progress through body counts, sortie rates, and bombing tonnage. Crisis management had become a bureaucracy of continuous escalation. That bureaucracy worked through a dense reporting chain. McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, MACV headquarters in Saigon, and the White House all pushed memoranda, target recommendations, casualty tables, and pacification statistics through the same decision cycle. Marines landed at Da Nang in March 1965 under the initial language of base defense. Then mission scope widened as combat patrols and offensive operations followed. The draft supplied manpower through local boards that often exposed class and regional inequality, while television footage and casualty notifications carried the war into American homes at a rate earlier conflicts had not done. The structure of escalation therefore included clerks, data charts, draft notices, and nightly briefings, as well as bombs and infantry. The mechanics of Tonkin deserve close attention because they show how incomplete evidence can harden into durable authority. The first clash on August 2nd involved the Maddox and North Vietnamese patrol boats. The second reported attack on August 4th was far less clear, shaped by confused radar, sonar readings, and tense interpretation in bad weather. Even so, Johnson used the moment to seek a resolution he had already been prepared to request under favorable conditions. Congressional approval came with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate. Once passed, the resolution became a standing warrant for air war, Marines at Da Nang, and a massive troop commitment far beyond the immediate Gulf incident. Rolling Thunder then demonstrated how a temporary authorization could become a long campaign with its own administrative momentum. Target lists moved through civilian and military review, sorties were counted against expected course of effect, and pause and resume cycles were used in hopes of signaling resolve or flexibility. The bombing did not produce the political collapse Washington expected, but it deepened American commitment by tying credibility to continued operations. In August 1964, the Johnson administration sent Congress a resolution drafted to look defensive and temporary while giving the president room to widen the war. The Gulf of Tonkin text authorized all necessary measures to repel armed attack and prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. Those four words, all necessary measures, carried the real weight. They appeared on paper as crisis language tied to a specific naval confrontation, but they could be carried forward into bombing campaigns, troop deployments, and open-ended escalation once the votes were banked. The room reveals the pressure. Many legislators were reading under pressure after reports of attacks at sea with little time and incomplete information about what had actually happened in the Gulf. Johnson needed a congressional instrument that looked restrained enough to pass fast and broad enough to support later force. That is why the phrasing stayed expansive while the occasion stayed narrow. Congress did not issue a formal declaration of war in the style of 1941. It handed over a legal political warrant that could be reopened whenever the executive branch decided the emergency had widened. Kennedy's quarantine during the Cuban Missile Crisis shows the other side of the same craft. He avoided the word blockade because blockade carried the legal meaning of war under international law, while quarantine suggested limited coercion and preserved diplomatic space. In Cuba, semantic precision helped slow escalation. In Tonkin, expansive wording enabled escalation. Korea had already shown that large-scale combat could proceed under UN authorization without declaration. Tonkin added another precedent. A short crisis document could authorize a long war. Cold War emergency government depended on that kind of language because a single phrase passed in haste could outlive the moment that produced it and govern years of killing afterward. The consequences of Cold War crisis policy differed by case, but the institutional direction was consistent. Korea ended in armistice and permanent deployment. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended in nuclear relief mixed with deeper vulnerability, and Vietnam produced the largest human and political cost. More than 58,000 Americans and far larger numbers of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian civilians and soldiers died, while Tet shattered official claims that steady escalation was bringing the war under control. Vietnam also triggered a reaction against the emergency habits those crises had normalized. Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1971 and passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973 over Nixon's veto in an attempt to reclaim authority over troop commitments. The law itself showed how far crisis containment had pushed the system away from the older expectation that major war required explicit legislative commitment at the outset rather than belated restraint after escalation. By the end of the 1960s, the United States had accumulated several models at once, i.e. permanent forward deployment from Korea, nuclear bargaining from Cuba, and broad delegated war from Vietnam. Later presidents inherited those tools as normal statecraft. The fact that they were inherited at all is the central consequence because each crisis taught the government how to act faster in the space between formal peace and formal war. That leaves no easy constitutional comfort. If emergency language, UN cover, quarantine vocabulary, and broad congressional resolutions can all widen executive war power, then the problem is not confined to one president or one theater. The unresolved question is whether a democracy built for perpetual crisis can still decide clearly when it is choosing security and when it is surrendering oversight.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.